As long as you weren't looking at the subject material of Alie's presentation, then you'd be okay. So,
yeah, there's none of that.
It'll make
Was that a segue? Was that a clever segue?
we could make it one.
I have nothing worthwhile to talk about from
Well, we could kind of mention the other ones after. Since he presented, you presented, we can
Sure.
segue into your presentation.
Sure.
Which you might want to give the actual full title first.
Yeah. Well, do I know the full title of my own presentation?
That's written down here somewhere.
Yeah, they changed
somewhere.
so much,
I mean, no. It's one of those titles that's like 30 words long or something.
Overly long to make it look
Exciting
academic.
phrase,
overly long.
explanation of what it actually is.
All right, so I would say that it almost does explain precisely what it is. It's called Speech We Hate, an argument for the cessation of international pressure on Japan to strengthen its anti-child pornography laws. So it's always a little bit of fun having that as a title because it tends to...
It actually sounds like you're saying, someone who doesn't know, hasn't listened to the presentation, it sounds like we should stop pressuring Japan to create anti-child pornography laws.
Yeah, it really does. It really does. And I got several people after the presentation coming up and saying, I was interested in what you were going to talk about, and I didn't get to come to your presentation, or I did, but it was different than what I was expecting. Yes, it was.
Yes, it was.
So
what's the basic crux of your?
Okay, so I want to contextualize the paper first. Like I mentioned in the previous iteration of this sort of conference podcast, is that I'm in the Communication Studies department at the University of Minnesota. But this paper, this project was completed at my undergraduate institution, Augsburg College, and I was a double major there. I also did international relations. So this paper was done as my thesis for that. So even though I'm in media studies right now, communication studies, it was done from a different framework. So just sort of keep that in mind.
International relations point of view.
Right. So there's not a lot of media theory or comm theory in it. It's more IR theory, more law. But the short of it is, I had been doing some research on manga and on gender and sexuality in Japanese history and sort of modern popular culture, and I'd gotten a lot of people saying things like, "Oh, well, isn't Japan a country of pedos?" And I mean, it
Right.
sounds ridiculous, but that's pretty much what people said to me.
People always say that.
Right, and they were dead serious, and it was people who I thought would have a more nuanced view, right, of cultural relativism and law and things like that. Peers of mine, right, who read manga.
Well, Japan is notorious for really bizarre pornography and such.
Wacky Japan.
The dream of
with
the
their
fisherman's wife. That's what it's
pedos,
called.
yeah.
Yeah, anyway.
And so it sort of developed out of that, and I wanted to look at the trajectory, the kind of path of laws that the U.S., the U.K., I looked at the EU, I looked at Canada, I looked at the UN, and I looked at Japan. And I didn't include all those in the presentation today, but I wanted to look at the ways that those countries, those groups have legislated against quote-unquote child pornography, which the definition of that is a whole other issue, which I really can't get into today because it's very complicated and tinged with lots of moral arguments and things like that, but and psychology that I don't really understand. So just know that that word, that phrase is complicated and comes with a lot of baggage. But I wanted to look at how they legislated against that. And I also wanted to look at the ways in which Western politicians, and of course Western is also in scare quotes, but Western politicians, Western media and rhetoric have kind of pressured Japan, right? Like, tisk tisk. You don't legislate as hard as we do, and that's harming efforts to stop child abuse and things like that. So that's really what I went into it, hoping to explore, to unpack. And ultimately I found out that there's such strict censorship laws in all of these Western countries, like laws that I don't think most people know exist, right? So this law in Canada that I talked about, before it was modified, literally outlawed depictions just depictions. So it didn't even have to be real minor, quote unquote, depictions of minors in anything sexually.
Oh,
So it
okay.
could have been art.
It didn't, what, also non-sexual depictions? Is that what
No,
you-
no,
Okay, I was
just
gonna say
sexual.
that.
Yeah, right. So if I say depictions of minors, just assume that I mean sexual depictions of
Okay.
minors.
So that makes sense. And when you mentioned Romeo and Juliet, because technically that's a sexual.
Yeah, I think that's something that's worth highlighting for the listeners, especially because when you say, when somebody thinks child porn,
Right.
which and let's be clear, there's a lot of gray area, but nobody is certainly going to advocate taking photos or exploitation of a kid who's 10 or 12 or something like that. But the way the laws are written, you specifically stressed minor,
Right.
and a minor. I don't know if the legal definition varies from country to country.
It does indeed.
But for in the United States, that would be anybody who's under the age of 18, which means that even if it's not an older, an adult and a minor, if you have two minors, like the example you used and that Chris just mentioned, Romeo and Juliet,
Yep.
who are,
Like 12.
Yep.
I don't know what it is in the Shakespeare story, but like 14 and 16 or 14 and
I think
15,
that's about right.
something like that.
14
Whatever
and
it is,
16.
yeah.
Whatever it is.
Late childhood or
You and this is what really hit me when you were talking about it in your presentation, is that you could not have a depiction of the two most famous lovers arguably in Western literature, even if it wasn't, we're not necessarily even talking graphic.
right. Just a picture of a genital, a picture of
them
Right.
them in an embrace, which
Right.
is obviously sexual.
Right.
Even if you're not like displaying graphically stuff, you could
Right.
not have that because it
Right.
would be illegal.
right.
So
And especially when it comes to art, and I mean, I think the definition of art needs to be sort of problematized as well. What counts as art?
Right.
And does anime and manga count as art? But anyway, but the point is that if hypothetically, and I can't think of a specific example, but there surely must be out there a gazillion medieval or Renaissance paintings of, for example, Adam and Eve, depicted in a way that makes them look like they're younger. And Adam and Eve, of course, are never depicted clothed in anything.
right.
So, you can't talk about. I mean, I don't know. I mean,
And since they certainly
really-
couldn't have been
there's that
over
one-
the age of 18 at creation.
Right.
So, yeah, exactly. So I mean, you have really famous painting of Venus,
Right.
By never mind that really famous painting of Venus, and she's definitely an adult in that particular painting, but if
Botticelli, but,
thank
yeah.
you. But if she, as the art historian in the room, thank you. But if she
High school art history. Good.
I have that painting.
if she had been
Represented.
depicted as younger, or if the judge decided that she looked younger, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
When you're talking about fictional depictions,
Right.
yes, I'm sure there is plenty of manga and anime and other stuff out there that is like, in the context of the story, they are a schoolgirl, therefore we know that they are
Right.
under 18. But if it's just an image, then it's up to the authorities to decide.
Right.
It's up to the random border guard who's getting paid $15 an hour,
Right.
or 30 or whatever it may be.
Right.
I don't know. To decide whether or not it's appropriate.
Right. I mean, I think all of these things that you're saying are really legitimate questions to ask in this kind of situation, because I think people, even in the West where these laws are in place, right, don't know the scope of them.
Right.
And I mean, basically the gist of the paper is that we have such strict censorship laws, and yet, well, and at the same time we shame Japan, right? Like, there are interviews of Japanese politicians, and there's this particular interview that I quote in this presentation of this Japanese senior superintendent of the police agency, and he says, "I went to this UN convention in Sweden back in '98, and I felt ashamed. People told me there that they were questioning Japan's standards of decency." The Japanese ambassador from a couple of years ago actually said, the fact that Japan allows people to possess sexual depictions of minors, child pornography, in any form, inhibits or keeps us from catching child abusers, child molesters, child rapists. And in this speech, he brings up this story of these young children that were molested and killed, I think, which of course has nothing to do with censorship laws, but they tie it together.
Right.
Right.
And so the gist of the paper and the presentation is that, we have such strict laws, and we shame Japan. Our politicians, our media shames Japan. Just do a Google search, child pornography Japan. So many inflammatory articles. And yet what's really
I think
ironic...
I'll hold off on Googling that. But
yeah. What's really ironic, and what really struck me when doing the research, was go look at UN laws about child rights and things like that. There's something called the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it's the most far-reaching international law on children's rights, right? Japan has signed and ratified it. Now, ratifying, you can sign something and say that you agree with it without ratifying it. Ratifying it means that you actually make steps within your own country, legal steps to make whatever's in the convention a reality. Okay?
Right.
Japan has signed and ratified it. There are only 2 countries that have not ratified the convention. It's Somalia and the U.S.
I would argue, though, that the U.S. does that a lot. Mostly for...
Yeah.
But for... I can't think of the political science term, but basically for their own protection. We'll
Right.
handle it ourselves. We don't
Right.
need to agree to it because this is something that
Just because we don't want the UN stepping in and telling
Sure.
us what
because
to
this
do.
is something that
Which is-
will take care of our own
which
borders.
is
This
which is
a-
fine, but let's wait until
Welcome to Honolulu.
They finally found the homeless guy.
He's not dead.
I don't want to go on the cat. Okay, which is a good point, and we do that frequently with even things like
Sovereignty
like
issues,
test
basically.
test ban
Yeah,
treaties
that's what I was looking for.
and the mine ban treaty. There were issues with that I think we followed a similar path because it blanket bans mines, and the United States uses certain anti-personnel mines that we can control. That where we feel we're meeting the intent of the thing, but we're not signing on to it because we don't want anybody else to have control over what we do with it.
Right.
And that's fine. I support that in certain instances, without getting too political here. But what you're saying, if I understand correctly, and what I agree with, is that you can't then turn around and say, shame on you, Japan, for not being as morally
Right.
upstanding as we are. If you don't have that legal, you can't do one thing and say another. Is really, I think, part of the point. And that I think we should just say something to the listeners here and explain, because there are probably several, 1 or 2 people out of our 5 people who actually listen to this.
Us 3 included.
Yeah, us 3 included.
I'll be a listener.
Yeah,
listening.
who are listening and they're like, wait, I came here expecting talk about samurai. And
We're not
Actually,
technically
that
off
stuff.
brand. We're still speaking about Japan.
No, but I want to make the point that this is, we're talking about different papers and different things that go on at an academic conference. And one of the valuable things about coming to something like this is that you get to meet, like we've met Alie, and listen to people who do things completely not related. They're related in the sense that they also have to do with Japan, but they're not necessarily the same thing that you do on a normal basis. And there's incredible value in that, because you see other perspectives, other methods of research, just in the last 2 days in talking to people both about my own topic and about the topics they're doing, I've opened up so many different avenues of other research that I want to pursue.
Oh yeah.
Like you guys were talking about the economics with the game theory and the Kurosawa bandits and stuff. And I talked with him, and he's going to send me a couple book titles to check out that'll help me in my research and so forth. And the point of it is that it doesn't matter what your own little section of this pie we call Japan and Japanese culture is. It's all important, and it's all something that even if you focus on Edo period
Agricultural manuals.
agricultural manuals. Wait, we know someone like that. Then the rest of this, understanding you're going to go to Japan and do research, and you're going to run in, you're going to go into the convenience store, and you're going to see manga, and it's going to have things, like depictions of children.
That mom never told you about.
Yes, that mom
Or
never
even
told you.
magazines with real 17, 15, 14-year-olds.
Yeah, whatever it is, and that's part of the greater context of just understanding. Somebody who studies, an art historian, for instance, may have perspectives on from what you see in, 17th century painting and representations of stuff that affect what Alie's talking about, and so on. And so that's kind of what we want to make sure that everybody understands, rather than just, they're talking about child porn laws. I think I'm going to turn this off now.
But for example, one of the papers we talked about in our last podcast about Chinese and Japanese war museums.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to address that kind of topic, and I have actually, I wrote a paper on the new Okinawan Prefectural Museum and how it relates Japan-Okinawa, how it reflects, how it represents Japan-Okinawa relations and America-Okinawa relations. And I approached it from a museum studies point of view, looking at the labels, looking at the arrangement of the gallery. So anyway, long story short, I just mean to say that even if somebody's coming from a different field or different discipline or a very different topic, for him to go and look at what people said about it and the political pressures and the political interactions,
Right.
is a very different approach, and it's valuable and interesting to me because I would never have even thought that could or should be a valid approach.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah.
So yeah, it's it's interesting, and for many of our listeners and us, if you've spent time in Japan and you've come across the question that you mentioned, aren't Japanese all a bunch of pedophiles who fetishize schoolgirl uniforms and stuff, and it's at one level you can kind of play it off and laugh about it or whatever, but at another level it's a very serious thing.
Right.
That you can't, not to say that one thing is bad and one thing is good or whatever, because there are certain moral standards
Right.
that we should all have.
Right.
I think, and most people would agree with that, but examining who chooses that and
Right.
how a culture like the United States or like Japan or like Europe goes about defining that,
Right.
and then how they choose to enforce it.
Right.
Like with the United States with the censorship laws versus Japan focusing on the production and the sale of that, as opposed to the possession or
Right,
whatever. I
right.
thought that was a really interesting, the different approaches that they take
Right.
And I think
And
I think also just it's very important to sort of put everything in perspective and understand relative, in the sense that I thought it was really fascinating what you were talking about, that in the U.S. and the U.K. we didn't have any particular, legally there was no real distinction between child pornography and all pornography until relatively recently, the 80s,
Right.
And so, who are we to say, like, we've always believed that you can't? No,
And I think one thing that, I found that I sometimes have to say or feel like saying to, especially people, when I decided to do this topic, even at my undergrad college, which is very open, right?
Yeah.
I had to kind of spend a whole semester explaining like why I'm taking this position. I think there's something that I always find myself saying is, so theoretically then, even if you want to say that any sexual depiction of a minor is wrong, right? The creation, the production, the dissemination, the possession, even if you think that, cultural imperialism is still wrong,
right.
right? So you can't do a wrong to make something right. You don't have that right or that responsibility. And so I
By
think...
depiction, do you mean just like created artwork? Or
Well, I'm just saying theoretically. Like, you say what you want about what you believe the morality or the ethics of it to be.
That it shouldn't
It doesn't make cultural imperialism right.
yeah, at what point are you going too far in imposing that standard on someone else?
Right.
I don't think anybody here, and I don't think anybody, I hope nobody listening would say that it's okay, that the actual physical exploitation of children is okay.
Right.
And that's certainly not the position that Alie or anybody is taking. So it's a lot easier when we're talking about actual pictures of actual people.
Right.
But when you get into
Photographs, film.
when you get into artistic representation of it, and especially when, like, I find it interesting that there's no distinction drawn, in no pun intended, on the content, like we were talking about with Romeo and Juliet. If you, according to U.S. law. Canada. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Although
Canada,
some states could easily
or some state,
make Romeo and Juliet illegal.
If you had the Romeo and a picture, a hand drawn picture of Romeo and Juliet in a sexual embrace, that would be considered illegal child porn according to Canadian law.
Yep.
Which just astounds me that
Although it has been modified, so it's not as strict. Once people started saying, like, oh, you know that you have to take down these paintings in museums, right? They're like, oh, maybe we should probably change the wording. But essentially, just assume that the US and Canada and the UK does not like depictions in any kind of form, even if they no longer have explicit wording about it.
Right.
I've seen depictions on TV of that type of situation. The law must not extend to
Or maybe it's just not
television.
quite enforced.
Right. I mean, within the U.S., in my presentation, I talk about this the weird way in which the U.S. laws have progressed, and basically, the Supreme Court has defended possessors, right, saying that you can possess and think about something as much as you want. We're not going to say that you can't, as long as you don't create it or exploit children.
Right.
Pretend about whatever you want. But then the Congress had said, no.
Right.
It's all bad all the time, right? And so what Congress ended up doing to sort of get back at the Supreme Court was say, okay, it won't be a federal law, but we're going to allow states to decide. Which of course means that there are some states that it's very, very, very strict, and some states that are probably a little bit less so.
Which is only going to create, crazy adventures, driving across state boundaries, or I'm serious. Like,
I guess I could
you're
see
going
that.
on a road trip. You happen to have some comic books in your back seat, or you're moving across country, and you're taking all your stuff with you, and you happen to be passing through Kansas on your way from New York to California.
Right.
And then you get pulled over for a broken taillight, and he looks in the back and says, "What's
and
that?"
Ooh, comic books. It reminds me of, and maybe it's not fully fair comparison, but I mean, I'm not really saying that we should or anyway, I mean, to have comic books about, like, rape, for example. But it reminds me of back in the 80s, I think it was. There were comic books. There was some particular, if you're into superhero comics, there's a couple of very major milestone issues or whatever about drug abuse, about superheroes who were themselves abusing drugs, right? Green Arrow. Green Arrow's unfortunately named sidekick Speedy, who was shooting up. And even though it was completely a story about why drug abuse is bad, the very depiction of drug abuse was completely against the comics code.
Oh, that's right.
Which is not law, but it's comics industry policy. And so they couldn't...
Yeah, they couldn't get the stamp of approval.
They couldn't get the stamp of approval for that issue. And so it's like... It kind of reminds me of a similar kind of thing. Like, I'm not saying that we need to or that we should have superhero comic books about why rape is bad, but... Or whatever, or why child pornography itself is bad, right? But if you depict it in a comic book, people exploiting children in order to show that it's bad, the very depiction of exploiting children in that comic book, right? So
let's take it to. I mean, this is theoretical, but it's a Japanese history context here. Is if you had a comic book that, or manga, anime, whatever it is, whatever medium, that depicted Oda Nobunaga
with Mori Ranmaru.
Exactly, Mori Ranmaru, who was his page, his one of his pages, and who was obviously younger, and who with whom he had sexual relations.
And that's historically accurate.
And that is historically
or just
accurate.
having any anime or manga about the Ooku or the Yoshiwara at all.
Right. But to continue with this, though, okay, not passing judgment on it one way or another, morally right, morally wrong. This is the historical fact.
Right.
This is how reality was. So you can't have anything that would depict that in a realistic sexual way.
Right.
Whether you're saying it's good, whether you're saying it's bad, that doesn't matter. If you went to Japan, went to a bookstore, found a comic book about the life of Oda Nobunaga, and it had this one picture in it, that would potentially get you into hot water.
And it's funny because
Is that the case, though,
What?
currently?
In Canada,
That if you bring stuff back.
Yeah, like if you have something, let's say it's a simple historical manga that has that particular image in one of the frames, is that under the current laws, is that...
I don't think under U.S. law, like art, quote unquote art, right? So kind of the way we think about art in terms of like museums and stuff, right?
Right.
So I don't think under U.S. law art is under that umbrella, but I think this is a good space to sort of clarify or contextualize for the listeners that although I wasn't in international relations, I'm not a law scholar. So while and I did the paper over a year and a half ago.
Right.
So some laws may be different, and I don't read law on a regular basis.
Yeah.
So just take everything, language with a grain of salt. But this is generally speaking.
So don't take this as legal advice.
Right. Don't. I'm not a lawyer, but this is what my IR background found me. So anyway, continue the conversation.
But I was going to say, actually, the gears are turning, and I'm thinking there are actually, I don't know how it works out in the law specifically, but there are definitely instances in which Japanese law is stricter than American law. Because I know, having worked on an art exhibition, a museum exhibition that included a few shunga pieces. So we're talking about 18th, 19th century Japanese paintings by famous ukiyo-e artists
depicting erotic acts.
Whose other paintings are quote-unquote normal pieces
Right.
of art that are perfectly fine and that are shown and that are celebrated. Exactly. And you have paintings depicting very explicit scenes. And they were depicted in... The exhibit traveled to like 5 different institutions in the U.S., and included these pieces and showed them as quote-unquote art. And some museums may or may not have put up signs kind of at the entrance warning parents not to bring your kids, whatever. In Japan, these pieces could not be shown.
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly what the rules are. Maybe it's about the depiction of pubic hair.
Yep, there's laws about depiction of pubic hair and on adult genitalia, interestingly enough.
So,
Which is why you see little black boxes and things like that covering up.
which is where
always-
cultural relativism comes in so much.
Yes, it is.
Why is it that manga does not depict pubic hair?
Always.
Because it's considered more disgusting.
Right.
And that's why people look younger.
Sometimes, yep.
Sometimes.
Yeah,
That's a good point.
Because they don't have the pubic hair, because the Japanese consider that more offensive to
Right.
show the pubic hair.
Yes.
So, anyway, but I think the very fact that you cannot show shunga in a Japanese museum exhibit when you can in America is indicative that I don't know. It leads into other things, other
I've always
aspects.
found it an interesting cultural difference, I guess is the best way to put it, that in the United States you can go get a magazine, and as long as everybody's an adult, you can open up a magazine and see the most explicit stuff that you, or that I could imagine anyway.
Look back at Hustler.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm talking beyond Playboy level. I mean,
Right.
but like, yes, very explicit in the act of sex,
Right.
pornography. But the actual act itself is so strictly regulated. However, in Japan, you go to it, and of course they have magazines and stuff and all that, but it's all censored in
Right.
the genital region. You can't open up a magazine and see naughty bits.
Right.
We'll keep it at that level.
Naughty bits. Is that like dirty bit?
Yeah, something like that. So, but
So not even
however,
on the interior. I haven't opened these magazines.
however, you can go, you know, 2 doors down to the Soapland or the you know, whatever establishment, and you can go access the real thing for
Right.
a fee, and it's just. It's interesting the way that moralism has affected laws in each country as to what is bad, what is the worst thing. Is it
Right.
seeing the bit in a magazine, or is it actually going and doing? Yeah, you know,
Right.
and I'm not going to take a position one way or the other
Right.
in this discussion, but it's just
Right.
interesting, and I think that kind of gets to what you're saying, is that there are different value systems and different value sets as far as what's unacceptable and what's not. And just because it's, you know, everybody's going to agree that physical and emotional harm to a minor, to a child,
Right.
is, you know, exploitation is bad. I don't
Right.
think anybody
I
disagrees
mean,
with
even
that.
Japan at this point,
Yeah.
after pressure from the West, has said, okay, we will outlaw creation, right?
Right.
So you cannot
Right.
exploit a child. And keep in mind, age of consent in Japan, last time I checked, was around 12 to 13.
No, well,
higher
Yeah, it's
now?
higher. I want to say that nationwide there's a minimum of 14,
Okay.
and most prefectures have raised it to, I want to say, 17 or so.
Okay. So either way,
Last I'd heard Tokyo, it was still 14.
Okay.
But most everywhere else, it was 17 or 18.
okay. But yeah, so I mean, just to be clear, even Japan has, after pressure from the West, said that creation, so actual exploitation of children and dissemination, is
Yeah.
illegal, although it's not often enforced. But possession, thought, basically, right? So they're equating possession with thought. You can think about whatever you want. Your personal life is your personal life.
Right.
Yeah, and but the West takes issue with that.